Hello and welcome to this lesson on short stories. This is Bridget, founder of empowermefirst.college. In this lesson you learn about literary types, the elements of a short story, how to analyze a short story, and about its structure. Literary types. As you may remember from Unit 1, there are different literary types. In Unit 1, we mostly looked at short, traditional texts, usually referred to as folk tales. From these texts, we can derive different types of literary forms. Think back to our examples. While most texts, such as legends or fables, were written in prose, songs were using the forms of poetry. So we look at form, including structure, literary and poetic devices, and mostly see three forms: poetry, drama, prose, which again can be put into fiction and non-fiction. Poetry. The specifics of poetry are that they use a lot of poetic devices such as metaphor, alliteration, rhyme, rhythm, repetition, and many more. They are usually short, focus on a feeling or philosophical thought, describe an atmosphere, and mostly don't have much of a plot. Of course, there are exceptions. Especially ballads can tell a story, and some plays use a lot of poetic elements, especially older playwrights such as Shakespeare. Poetry is possibly the oldest form of literature, together with other shorter literary forms which you learned about in the lesson on oral traditions. Drama. Dramas are plays. They are acted out on stage, we call it dramatized, and are written in dialogues. Movies are forms of plays. In ancient Greek traditions, dramas were supposed to have 5 scenes, a linear plot. The characters were rather stereotypical. Example, the king, the queen, the servant. They were facing a dilemma and conflicts that could not be solved, which was often caused by mistakes they had made due to personal failure. One typical example of personal shortcomings was hybris, which could be translated as pride or arrogance and fate. Often in stories, the two were combined. A hero shows hybris, in English sometimes pronounced as hubris, by not accepting his God-given destiny, and this leads to a catastrophe. A good example is the story of Oedipus. The oracle, that is a priestess in the ancient Greek society that foretells your future, foretold his parents that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Naturally, the parents were scared and asked the shepherd to kill the toddler. The shepherd took pity on the child, and instead of killing him, he took him to the woods and cut his ankle, so he would not be able to walk back. But instead of being eaten by wild animals, he was found by another king who was childless and adopted the boy, calling him Oedipus, which means swollen foot. As a young man, the oracle again tells him that he would kill his father and marry his mother. He of course doesn't want to do that and leaves his home, not knowing that he was adopted. On his way, he has to cross a river on a narrow footbridge. where only one person could walk. Another man crosses from the other side. Both are kings, neither wants to give way. Can you guess the rest of the story? Do you want to know more? Why not watch or read about it? Just research the story of Oedipus after watching this video. It has become a very important metaphor in psychology, where it's called the Oedipus complex. Prose. Poetry and drama both are also fictional, as an author uses the imagination to create a world that is not necessarily based on facts. Yet it can carry a deeper type of truth. For example, on the human nature, like the hubris we talked about before. But in the English language, when we use the term fiction, we usually don't think of poetry or drama, but mean narrative literature, which is written in prose and tells or narrates a story. In this unit, we will get to know one form of fiction, the short story. Non-fiction. Within prose, we also have non-fictional texts. These are texts talking about facts and situations. For example, newspaper articles, biographies, your textbooks, or scientific papers. Even non-fictional texts may have subjective elements. For example, if we give a description of someone that puts him in a negative light. The elements of a short story. Every story is different, and writers, of course, have what we call a poetic license, meaning they can choose how they want to write a story. Nevertheless, there are certain elements that are typical for short stories, some of them already given by the nature of the length of the story. Focus on action and single situation. As the term suggests, short stories are usually quite short. This means there's not much room for development. The focus is on a single situation, one setting mostly, and the actions. There's rarely a change of scene or much development. The action is exemplary for a human situation. Just imagine a photo capturing a moment in the life of a person that has been a turning point in their lives. There might also be a focus on dialogue and the character's thoughts about the situation. Secondly, it has a small cast. To keep the focus on the exemplary action and situation, the cast is usually small. For example, there might be an interaction between a couple, like in the arrangements of marriage, or in the case of the story Thank You Ma'am, between a boy and a lady who meet on the street. Little characterization. As there is no room to develop a character throughout the years, as you would have in a novel, we often have simple descriptions of a person. For example, in the arrangements of marriage, the narrator calls her husband simply my new husband. What do you think that might suggest about this relationship? You will find out more once you have read, analyzed, and interpreted the story. open ending. In the same way as the story jumps right into the action, there often is an open ending. We don't know what will happen to the protagonist, but we can imagine a likely change in their mindset or lives. This is very much in contrary to dramas, which often have a very clear ending. In a tragedy, for instance, you will have all the characters killing each other, for example. Like Oedipus, he has a very tragic ending. In a comedy, you have a happy end. Hollywood movies usually use the happy end. Then the narrator. Stories have narrators. They can either be distant third-person narrators who may take an objective view, even know more than the protagonists, or there can be one of the protagonists themselves. We basically have 7 types of narrators, which are sometimes combinations. The first-person narrator has 2 subtypes. One shows the story from one of the protagonists. This view can change to another character throughout the story. Such a switch is more likely in longer stories. It can also be a witness character who retells something they have experienced while staying outside the action. For example, you might have a story where a passenger on a boat talks about a conflict that happened on that boat. The second-person narrator speaks directly to the reader. This narrator is rare and usually doesn't go through the whole of the story, but may be part of the third-person narrator. There are 4 types of first-person narrators. They are usually an external narrator close to the author. The first view is called the limited third-person narrator. This means this narrator only knows what the protagonists do. Secondly, the narrator can be omniscient, meaning that he has information that the characters can't have, but that are relevant to the reader in order to be able to understand the situation. For example, why a person is afraid of the sea becomes clearer if we know that he nearly drowned as a toddler. Thirdly, the narrator can be unreliable, sharing untrue or misleading information to confuse the readers and allow them to take a step back and investigate. This one is rather rare though. What we sometimes might have are subjective views which we will need to analyze and to find the truth of the story. Fourthly, we have a fly-on-the-wall narrator who is objective like a camera. How do we analyze a short story? While every story has a different focus, style, setting, or context, we also have a set of strategies of how to analyze a story. Comprehension is at the core of and the first step to an analysis and interpretation. Before you do the following steps, make sure you understood vocabulary used in the story. If you didn't, look them up in an online dictionary. Once you've done that, you can follow the following steps. Be aware of the fact that not each step is relevant to the story you were reading. What is the topic or theme of your story? Is it a tale about honesty or about jealousy? Is it talking about poverty or greed? It helps to summarize the story, but in the end, you have to dig deeper and understand what the topic is and what it wants to tell us in its core. The term topos, plural topoi, comes from the Greek and means a common place, or according to Merriam-Webster, which is one of the dictionaries you can use to look up words, a traditional or conventional literary or rhetorical theme or topic. Understanding the theme or topos of a story is central in forming a thesis for your interpretation. Analyzing the setting and the characters will allow you to understand the motives for their actions. For example, if you have a story of a poor fisherman with 5 children who goes out in the sea during a storm, we understand that he takes this risk to feed his family. If the story is set in ancient times, where people still believed in different gods, we also understand that in his fear he's calling out to the god of the sea. In short stories, both the setting and the characters are usually kept simple, as the focus is on the actions and the outcome for the protagonists. The plot is a sequence of events and actions of the short story or play. We usually summarize a plot in a chronological order, even if it's told in a non-linear way or anachronic way. Conflict and dilemma are also central, both to creating suspense and to allowing the readers to reflect on a human problem and how it could be solved. Together with the topos, focusing on the protagonist's conflicts and dilemmas will allow you to understand the story in a wider meaning and form a thesis of interpretation. For some texts, it can be very helpful to understand the contexts in which they were written. This can be the political or historical setting or the biography or views of the author. For example, if an author is a feminist, she may focus on stories talking about gender equality. If an author has been a soldier, he may speak from his heart and may want you to stop believing that war is necessary by telling a story about the horrors of war. Whatever you analyzed, you have to take a record of. In your interpretation, you will have to give reference with examples and quotes. The beauty of literature, analysis and interpretation is that you are free to choose your personal approach to it. There is no right or wrong as such, but you must give reference and focus on the evidence you find, either by quoting a passage in the text or finding facts about the time structure or the author that strengthens your arguments. Besides looking at plot, characters, setting, context, we can also look at the form. And by analyzing the form, understand more about what the story wants to tell us. We can look at literary and poetic devices, the story's language and style in general, and its structure. The anachronic or non-linear storytelling is more common in longer prose, for example, novels. Basically, it means that we jump back and forth in time or receive different views of the same situation. A bit like a split screen in a film. It helps to create suspense if we don't get all the information right away. Foreshadowing is one of the techniques to create a non-linear storytelling and suspense. The author leaves clues the reader may not even notice that they are hinting towards future events. Read carefully to see if you can find any clues in the story The Landlady. Flashback. Flashbacks are the opposite of foreshadowing. They allow the reader to learn more about the protagonist's past. They can either be a thought or a third-person narrator telling about something happening in the past. Parallel storyline. We can tell a story from different angles. For example, if there was a fight between a man and his wife, we can tell it from both sides. This allows us to understand not just what happened, but also why the two protagonists did what they did. Implicit versus explicit. We have already learned about implicit and explicit. Implicit means that we say things indirectly, while explicit means that everything is said straight out. In literature, usually we use the implicit way of telling a story. This allows the reader to investigate and try to understand. It not only creates suspense, but also makes us think about what is being said. It gives room for interpretation.